I had just taken my first sip of morning coffee when I noticed them. 4 figures standing outside my front yard. Matching polo shirts, sunglasses, cheap clipboards, and an air of authority that screamed cosplay. I squinted through the window. They weren't police. They weren't contractors. But they were here like they owned the place. I knew trouble when I saw it. And this wasn't just trouble. This was Margaret Hayes. She stood at the front of the group, arms crossed, lips pursed like she'd just chewed a lemon. Her freshly dyed auburn bob was stiff with hairspray, her eyes scanning my home like a general surveying enemy territory. Behind her, Rick scribbled furiously in a notepad. Sheila clutched a toy walkie-talkie to her belt like it was a badge of honor, and Carl, the guy built like a fridge with a t-shirt 2 sizes too small, wore a smug grin that made my fingers itch. I set my mug down. Peace was officially over. When I opened the door, Margaret didn't wait for pleasantries. She launched into her speech like a prosecutor at a press conference. Lucas Reed, you are in serious violation of HOA standards. We are here to take civil enforcement action. I blinked. Come again? She thrust a laminated piece of plastic in my face, some kind of knockoff ID badge with a clip art gavel and the words HOA Enforcement Unit. We have received multiple reports regarding your non-compliant garage color, the unauthorized vehicle on your property, and… She paused, drawing breath for dramatic effect. Hostile behavior toward community members. I raised an eyebrow. You mean refusing to attend your wine and cheese cult meetings? Your attitude is exactly the problem, she snapped. You've ignored repeated warnings. Under the HOA charter, we are exercising our right to civil custody. Civil custody? I leaned against the doorframe and tried to keep a straight face. So, you're trying to arrest me? Carl stepped forward and pulled something from his cargo shorts. Plastic handcuffs. He wiggled them like a prize at a carnival booth. We have our methods, he said with a puffed chest. I nearly laughed. This wasn't just ridiculous. It was criminal. But instead of slamming the door in their faces, I decided to play along. For now. Interesting, I said, stroking my chin. And how exactly do you plan to arrest me? Rick perked up, ready to read me my rights like he was auditioning for a soap opera. Margaret just nodded solemnly, as if the HOA had suddenly been deputized by the Department of Justice. It was time. In one smooth motion, I pulled my leather badge wallet from my back pocket, flipped it open, and held it up at eye level. The morning sun caught the silver of the badge just right, and the air seemed to change. I'm the town marshal, I said calmly. Real badge, real authority, real jail time for impersonating law enforcement. Margaret's face fell faster than her approval ratings. You're bluffing, she said, voice cracking. I stepped forward, letting the badge catch the light again. You've got 5 seconds to get off my property before I arrest you for impersonation and attempted kidnapping. The silence was delicious. Carl stepped back. Rick dropped his notepad. Sheila's hand trembled on her walkie-talkie. Margaret stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Then, like rats fleeing a sinking HOA ship, they began backing away. It's not over yet, Margaret barked, retreating down the walkway with her minions in tow. I watched them go, feeling a mixture of disbelief and amusement. But deep down, I knew. That was just the opening move. The rest of the day passed in eerie quiet. No emails, no knocks, no cones on the driveway. But that silence carried weight, like the moment before a thunderstorm hits. Margaret Hayes wasn't just a control freak. She was a storm in heels, and storms don't retreat. They regroup. As I closed the door and picked up my coffee again, I felt it in my gut. This was just the beginning of a long, ugly war. One that wasn't going to be fought with words or warnings. No, Margaret would escalate. And when she did, I'd be ready. Because she thought she was taking on a passive homeowner, but she had no idea she'd just declared war on a marshal. The next morning, the war began. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, ready to shake off the remnants of yesterday's ridiculous encounter. But something was wrong. My trash bins, 2 large city-issued containers, were gone. Not moved, not misplaced. Gone. Vanished like a magician's rabbit. I checked the side of the house, the curb, even behind the shed. Nothing. Then I saw her. Across the street, arms crossed, sunglasses on, Margaret Hayes stood like the proud overseer of a conquered kingdom. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just offered the tiniest, most infuriating smirk and turned away, disappearing inside her perfectly trimmed fortress. I let out a long breath. Okay, Margaret. You want a war? Let's play. I walked to the mailbox and found the next punch waiting for me. An envelope stamped with the HOA seal, stuffed with neatly typed pages. I already knew it was nonsense before I opened it. Inside was a list of sanctions. According to the letter, I was banned from using the neighborhood's waste disposal services, forbidden to park in my own garage until compliance was verified, mandated to attend a behavioral correction meeting to address my ongoing hostility toward the community. I laughed, loudly, right there on the lawn. A neighbor across the street paused mid-dog walk to stare. I didn't care. I tore the pages in half, letting the pieces scatter like confetti across my driveway. But Margaret wasn't done. Later that afternoon, I returned home from a supply run to find a bright orange cone sitting in the center of my driveway. Next to it stood a wooden post with a laminated notice stapled to it. It read, "Garage closed. HOA Enforcement Directive Violation. 187. Unauthorized property use." I blinked. She had literally tried to shut down my garage like it was a condemned restaurant. I walked over, ripped the notice off the post, and launched the cone into the gutter with a flick of my wrist. And just like a poorly timed sitcom, her henchmen were watching. Rick and Sheila stood across the street with their usual props, clipboard and toy radio. Rick scribbled something feverishly. Probably, "Homeowner removed safety cone in defiance." Not even 2 minutes passed before Margaret stormed out of her house like a bull charging red. "You can't do that," she barked, pointing at the empty spot where the cone had been. I held up the laminated notice like it was a used napkin. "This trash? That is a formal HOA sanction," she snapped, face flushing. "You are not allowed to ignore community orders." I stepped toward her slowly. "Margaret, you have no authority to ban my garage, block my driveway, or touch my property. All you've got is some cheap office supplies and a god complex." Her mouth opened, then closed. She sputtered, turned on her heel, and stomped back to her house, slamming the door hard enough to shake her fake holiday wreath. But that wasn't the end. It never is with people like her. The next morning, as I clocked in at the sheriff's office, my phone buzzed. It was Ben Carter, my only sane neighbor. "Lucas," he said, voice low. "You might want to come home." "What's wrong?" "There are 2 police cars in front of your house." I froze. "What the hell?" "They said they got a tip. Something about a man with a gun on the premises." Cold settled in my stomach. This was it. Margaret had crossed the line. I drove back like a bat out of hell. When I pulled up, I saw 2 patrol units parked in front of my home. The officers were standing on the sidewalk, talking to her. Margaret Hayes, in full dramatics, hand over chest, voice trembling, eyes darting around like she was worried about sniper fire. She was putting on a show for the ages. The moment I stepped out of my truck, both officers recognized me. "Oops," one of them muttered awkwardly. "Hey, Chief." I nodded. "Got a report?" They exchanged a glance. "Yeah, anonymous tip. Said there was suspicious activity, possibly armed individual. Just doing our due diligence." I looked directly at Margaret. "Let me guess. Came from this side of the street?" She clutched her pearls like I'd just accused her of theft. "I only reported what I heard. Someone saw something, and I acted out of concern for the safety of the community." One of the officers sighed, clearly fed up. "We'll log it as a false alarm. But Miss Hayes, just so you know, filing false police reports is a criminal offense." That shook her. For the first time, Margaret looked genuinely rattled. Her hands fidgeted. Her eyes flicked away. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, arms folding defensively. The officers left. I didn't say another word, just stared at her as she stood there, shrinking under the weight of her own lie. But I knew she wasn't done. This woman wasn't wired to retreat. If the false arrest didn't work, if the police tip failed, She had to be cooking up something even worse. And sure enough, she was. The following day, just before sunrise, I was awakened by a loud beeping sound outside. Heavy, rhythmic, industrial. Still in my t-shirt and pajama pants, I stumbled to the window. A full-sized construction truck had parked directly in front of my house. Men in reflective vests and hard hats began unloading cones, rolling out tape, and unstrapping equipment. A mini excavator idled near the curb. What the hell? I threw on jeans and boots, stormed out onto the lawn, and intercepted the man with the clipboard. "Morning," he said cheerfully. "We're here to begin emergency pipe repair." I blinked. "Where?" "Here," he said, gesturing to my front yard. "There's no leak here." He pointed to the order form. "Says here request was submitted by the HOA president. Name? Margaret Hayes." Of course. I glanced across the street. There she was, again. Arms crossed, that smug smile like she was savoring the moment. I took a long breath. "Buddy," I said calmly, "there's no issue here. No leak, no water damage. And you're not authorized to dig up a single inch of my property." He hesitated. "Well, we're already here." I reached into my jacket, pulled out my badge. The effect was immediate. He blanched. The clipboard trembled in his hands. I didn't even have to say another word. "Guys," he called to his crew, "let's wrap it up." Margaret came charging across the street, indignant. "You can't interfere with HOA infrastructure." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "And you can't commit fraud, trespass on private property, or waste city resources." She paused, speechless. She opened and closed her mouth several times, but no sound came out. Then finally, flushed, furious, and defeated, she spun around and stormed back to her house. But I wasn't smiling, because I knew her type. She wouldn't stop until someone stopped her. And now, it was my move. I knew Margaret wasn't finished, not after the cone, not after the false police report, and definitely not after her failed excavation stunt. People like her, power-obsessed and image-driven, don't stop when they lose. They double down. They rebrand failure as conspiracy and setbacks as martyrdom. So when I received the envelope slid under my door the following Thursday morning, I wasn't even surprised. Subject: Community Disciplinary Hearing, Mandatory Attendance. It read like a court summons, typed in all caps, with phrases like threat to harmony, disregard for authority, and recommended removal from residency. Recommended removal? Margaret Hayes was trying to expel me from my own home. She had crossed into delusion, and I decided it was time I stopped reacting and started playing offense. The hearing was scheduled for Friday night. That same afternoon, I spent hours collecting documents. I pulled copies of the HOA's charter from the county clerk's office. I dug up public records, property deeds, financial reports that had been conveniently left out of Margaret's monthly newsletters. And then I visited a few neighbors. Not all of them slammed their doors. Some had their own stories. One widow had been fined for a non-compliant mailbox color after her husband passed away. Another family was forced to repaint their fence twice in 1 month because Margaret changed the approved hue halfway through. None of them had fought back. Most were just tired. But I wasn't tired. I was just getting started. Friday evening arrived like the climax of a courtroom drama. The community hall was full. Rows of plastic chairs, clipboards stacked on tables, bottled water lined up like evidence. Some neighbors looked curious, others uncomfortable. A few avoided my gaze altogether. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat the self-appointed HOA tribunal. And at the center, dressed like a lawyer at a press conference, sat Margaret Hayes. She shuffled a stack of papers, cleared her throat, and stood. "We are here tonight to address the escalating disruptions caused by Mr. Lucas Reed," she began, her voice honeyed but laced with poison. "As many of you know, Mr. Reed has repeatedly ignored HOA guidelines, disrespected authority, and created an environment of hostility." A few people nodded. Most remained silent. She continued, flipping pages with the flair of a soap opera villain. "We have documented violations, including unauthorized property modifications, interference with HOA contractors, failure to attend mandatory meetings, and—" "Fake arrest attempts," I interrupted, loud and clear. The room stiffened. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me?" I stood, calm, steady. "Let's talk about the plastic handcuffs, the pretend badges, the fake arrests you tried to pull in my yard. You forgot to mention that part." Murmurs broke out across the room. Margaret forced a tight smile. "This is not the time for unfounded accusations." Unfounded? I stepped forward and dropped a folder onto the table in front of her. "This is the HOA charter you violated. Right here, Section 4B. No member shall impersonate law enforcement or detain a resident under false authority." Sound familiar? Her smile faltered. "And here," I added, flipping to the next page, "is your financial report, the one you edited before posting online. I've got the original from last quarter. Guess what's missing? Over $9,000 in administrative fees for events that never happened." She stood up, fists clenched. "That's confidential." "No, Margaret. That's fraud." Gasps echoed through the room. Someone in the back whispered, "Wait, what?" I wasn't done. I turned to the crowd. "Ask yourselves, when was the last time we had an HOA election? I'll tell you, 4 years ago." Margaret was only supposed to serve 1 year before a mandatory re-election. But the vote never happened. She just stayed. Silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but heavy, charged with the weight of realization. Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She was cornered, and she knew it. "This meeting," I said, raising my voice so every chair-bound resident could hear, "isn't about community. It's about control. You've been bullied, fined, manipulated, and lied to, and I'm done watching it happen." A few heads nodded. Someone clapped once, tentatively, then stopped. Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "This is absurd. You don't belong here, Lucas. You've never fit in." I looked straight at her. "I don't need to fit into a dictatorship. I live here. This is my home. And your little empire?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "It's crumbling." She froze. And for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not of me, but of truth. Of losing the only thing she truly cared about. Power. I stepped back, folded my arms, and waited. No one came to her defense. Not Rick. Not Sheila. Not even Carl, who was now studying the floor like it held the secrets of the universe. Margaret stared out across the room and realized the walls were closing in. But I knew better. This wasn't her final play. Because Margaret Hayes wasn't just going to surrender. She was going to burn something down on her way out. And I was right. Because the next morning, the authorities showed up at my door. Not police this time. County inspectors. Clipboard-wielding, badge-wearing, no-nonsense officials. And as I watched their car pull up, I saw her. Standing across the street, smiling. She had filed a formal complaint. And now, she was about to find out that truth doesn't bend forever. Not even for her. Saturday morning came with sirens. Not the wailing kind. No red lights flashing. Just the quiet screech of bureaucracy. The unmistakable crunch of city vehicles pulling up to a residence flagged for inspection. I opened the front door before they even knocked. 2 county inspectors stood at the bottom of my steps, clipboards in hand, bright orange vests gleaming in the early sun. "Good morning, sir," one said stiffly. "We've received a complaint regarding multiple structural irregularities on this property. We're here to conduct a full inspection." I didn't ask who filed the complaint. I already knew. Across the street, standing like a smug gargoyle in yoga pants, Margaret Hayes watched with folded arms and a fake expression of innocent curiosity. I turned back to the inspector. "What kind of irregularities?" "According to the report, unauthorized additions, plumbing violations, and potential pest infestations." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "Of course," I said. "Well, come on in. Let's get started." If Margaret thought I had something to hide, she clearly didn't understand who she was dealing with. My house was clean. My permits were in order. My plumbing could pass a NASA test. For 2 full hours, the inspectors went over everything. They measured, tapped walls, opened cabinets, checked under sinks. They took photos. They asked technical questions. I answered each one with a calm smile and a paper trail. Outside, Margaret hovered like a hawk waiting for a kill. Rick stood beside her, scribbling in his endless notepad. Sheila filmed with her phone like she was gathering courtroom evidence. But their hope was short-lived. Eventually, the younger inspector returned to the front door, looking slightly sheepish. "Mr. Reed," he said, "we found no violations. Your property is fully compliant with all county regulations." "Nothing?" I asked with mock surprise. He shook his head. "Everything looks perfect, sir." Behind him, I could practically hear Margaret's ego collapsing like an old deck of cards. "Good," I said, crossing my arms, "because I'm filing a formal complaint. Harassment, false reporting, HOA misconduct. I have every name, every document, and I want a record made today." The inspector blinked, clearly not expecting that. "Yes, sir. We can help you initiate the process." I didn't wait. I pulled out my phone and began dialing the inspection department directly. Margaret saw what I was doing and cracked. She came marching toward me, fury in every stomp. "This is an overreaction," she snapped. "It was just a safety precaution." I hung up mid-ring and turned to her slowly. "Strange," I said, "because the inspectors just told me there wasn't a single thing wrong. So either you lied, or you're catastrophically bad at your job." Her cheeks flushed. "This is harassment." "No, Margaret. What you've done is harassment. This ends now." But it didn't. Not right away. The complaint I filed triggered something bigger than either of us anticipated. Apparently, I wasn't the first. Over the following week, other residents came forward. People who'd been fined for imaginary violations. People whose repair requests had been ignored while Margaret funneled HOA funds into special events, which turned out to be exclusive wine parties for her and her clique. The real kicker? Margaret wasn't even the legitimate HOA president. The charter required an annual re-election. She hadn't held one in 4 years. She'd simply declared herself queen, and no one had challenged her, until now. A special town meeting was called, not by Margaret this time, but by the HOA board itself, now under scrutiny. It wasn't a hearing, it was a reckoning. That night, the community hall was packed wall to wall. For once, Margaret didn't look in control. Her hair wasn't perfect. Her blouse wasn't ironed. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She stood at the front of the room, clutching a binder like it might save her from drowning. But the room had changed. There were no nodding followers, no cronies, just neighbors, finally seeing her without the mask. A county auditor stood beside the board and presented his findings. More than $30,000 missing from HOA funds. Unauthorized contractor deals, falsified records. The room buzzed with shock, anger, betrayal. Margaret tried to explain. She claimed she had receipts, claimed the funds went to community enhancement. But no one listened. The numbers spoke louder than her excuses. Then came the vote. Unanimous. Margaret Hayes was officially removed from office. She stood frozen, blinking like she couldn't believe the crown had slipped. Then, the final blow. The county sheriff, who had been standing quietly near the exit, stepped forward with a warrant in hand. Fraud. Embezzlement. Falsifying public records. Margaret turned, tried to leave, but 2 deputies stopped her at the door. As they cuffed her, someone in the back shouted, "Well done, Margaret!" The room erupted in laughter. As she was escorted out, defeated, red-faced, and humiliated, I felt something lift in the room, like a window had been opened after years of stale air. In the weeks that followed, the HOA was rebuilt from the ground up. Fines were reviewed and canceled, policies rewritten. The new board, led by residents who actually gave a damn, swore to never let one person hold unchecked power again. People talked to each other again, smiled more. Front yards blossomed with individuality. And as for Margaret? Word spread that she sold her house quietly, packed her bags and vanished. Some say she moved to another town, probably somewhere with a new neighborhood to conquer, but not here, not anymore. One morning, as I watered my garden, Ben walked by and gave a thumbs up. "You hear?" he said. "Her house finally sold." I nodded. "Yeah. Hope the next owner likes freedom." He laughed. "It's nice, you know. Peace. It feels real now." I looked down the street. Fresh air. No cones, no laminated notices, no clipboards or fake radios. Just life. And for the first time in a long time, it was ours again. Final message. Tyrants don't always wear crowns. Sometimes they carry clipboards. But the power they hold only exists if no one speaks up. And when one voice becomes many, even self-made queens fall. In the end, Margaret Hayes didn't fall because I exposed her. She fell because she believed no one ever would. That's the thing about power. It doesn't corrupt overnight. It whispers. It flatters. It convinces people they're doing the right thing while building a throne out of silence, fear, and convenience. And for a while, Margaret ruled. She ruled with passive-aggressive letters, petty fines, and fake rules dressed up in fake authority. She didn't need real laws, just people too tired to fight, too busy to push back, too isolated to realize they weren't alone. She thought fear would keep her safe. But the truth? Fear only works until someone stands up. I wasn't special. I was just a guy who got tired of being told where to park, what to paint, and when to smile. I had a badge, sure. But that didn't stop Margaret. It wasn't the badge that brought her down. It was exposure, truth, and a neighborhood that finally opened its eyes. The real victory. This story was never about one crazy HOA president. It was about what happens when people stop paying attention. When we hand over our voice in exchange for convenience. When we say, it's not worth it, until it's too late. But it was also about how quickly things can change the moment one person decides they've had enough. I didn't know what would happen when I stood up at that community meeting. I didn't know if anyone would believe me, let alone back me. But that's the funny thing about courage. It doesn't guarantee success. It just opens the door. And once the truth was out there, people didn't just listen. They acted. Because deep down, we all know the difference between right and wrong. Sometimes, we just need permission to say it out loud. What you can take with you. You don't need to live in a gated community to face people like Margaret. They exist in office buildings, online forums, classrooms, and even families. Anywhere there's unchecked power and no accountability. Here's what I learned, and maybe it'll help you too. Just because someone talks with authority doesn't mean they have it. If someone's power depends on your silence, your questions are their greatest threat. Document everything. Truth is your shield. Keep receipts. Keep records. The facts are always your strongest weapon. Don't underestimate quiet people. Some of the most powerful resistance I saw came from neighbors who barely spoke until it really mattered. Bullies escalate when they lose control. Don't be surprised when they lash out harder. It means you're winning. You don't need to burn the whole system, just shine a light on it. Change doesn't always come from war. Sometimes it comes from one voice saying, this isn't right. A neighborhood reclaimed things are different now. Kids play freely on the sidewalk without getting scolded for unauthorized chalk art. Neighbors stop to talk instead of rushing inside to avoid conflict. We wave. We smile. We live. There's no longer a feeling of being watched. Just the warmth of being seen. And that might be the biggest win of all. Because once a community reclaims its voice, nothing, no rule, no fine, no clipboard, can take it away again. Before you go, this story, it could have ended very differently if I had stayed silent, if the inspectors hadn't been honest, if the neighbors hadn't opened their eyes, but they did, and so did you. So I'll leave you with this. What if the next Margaret doesn't wear a name tag? What if the next silent rule isn't posted in your driveway, but on your screen? Would you notice? Would you speak? Would you stand? The world is full of quiet tyrannies, some in suits, others in sweatpants, but they all have one thing in common. They rely on your silence to survive. So don't be silent. Be curious. Be bold. Be the neighbor who asks why. Because sometimes, all it takes to bring down a kingdom built on fear is someone willing to knock on the gate and say, not today. If you enjoyed this story and want more bold, cinematic tales of justice, redemption, and the unexpected, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow the Story Forge. Every week we bring you true stories told with heart, fire, and just the right amount of rebellion. Now it's your turn. Have you ever faced a Margaret in your life? How did you fight back? Or how do you wish you had? Drop your story in the comments below. Let's build a community where your voice matters. Because here at the Story Forge, we don't just tell stories. We forge legends.